Hello everyone and welcome to the Just Transition launch webinar. We're admitting participants, so we'll give it a minute and then we will start. Thank you for waiting. Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. This is the third day of COP26 and we warmly welcome everyone on behalf of the World Benchmarking Alliance to the Just Transition launch webinar. My name is Vicky Sins and I lead the Decarbonisation and Energy Transformation, of which the Just Transition is part of at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And in this virtual event, we will present the findings of the Just Transition assessments that we've performed. And you will also hear from experts and leaders in the field on an interesting dialogue. First of all, I would like to welcome Hubert Danso, and he's the CEO and chairman of the African Investor Group. He's an experienced chairman and on numerous boards and has demonstrated a history of working with international and African institutional investors. And Hubert has supported the development of the Just Transition methodology from the start. He has a seat on our Just Transition advisory group, and he continues to challenge our thinking, encourage our ambition to really make sure that the Just Transition and equity underpin the transition to a low carbon economy. So first of all, welcome to Hubert Danso.
Thank you. As was mentioned, my name is Hubert Danso. I am the chair of Africa Investor, an institutional infrastructure investment platform, and the chair of the African Union's Continental Business Network, the CBN, which is a pension and sovereign wealth fund leaders investment network of chairmen and CEOs and CIOs. This was established by the African Union in partnership with a large group of African asset owners. I'm also proud to be a member of the Just Transition Advisory Group that presided over these assessments that we'll be discussing later on today. As we all know, efforts to address the negative impacts of job losses and industrial transition on workers and communities and to enhance access to the opportunities associated with the transition, including decent, sustainable jobs and the growth of green sectors, have risen rapidly on the international agenda since 2015. With the social and economic impacts of COVID-19's pandemic now becoming very, very clear, many are calling for a green and just recovery from the crisis. And just and equitable transition must therefore be considered a global imperative, a challenge not only to our economies, but to our very humanity. Currently, the Just Transition is what I describe as the elephant in the text of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement's Achilles heel to a binding and full implementation. A Just Transition is part of the 2015 Paris Agreement, where the ambitions are made very clear, as we know, which is essentially to keep the rise of global temperatures to a 1.5 degree scenario compared to pre-industrial levels. The need for a just transition, as set out in the Paris Agreement in its preamble, cites the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. When combined with the related issues of environmental integrity and climate justice, this is an often overlooked and prominent ESG issue that all stakeholders, advanced economies, development partners and institutions, investors, companies and civil society alike are ethically obliged to integrate and address as a core ESG issue, being the need to take full account of the social impact of the S, which far too often is overlooked and subordinated without due attention to the social and economic devastation caused to billions of underprivileged workers, communities, livelihoods, lives, and economic competitiveness of emerging and developing countries to participate and compete in the new $11 trillion plus global green industrial economy. We are fumbling and on a collision course again with state-sponsored inequity, like we saw with Africa only gaining access to about 1% of global vaccines and having its economic recovery chastised as a direct consequence. Inaction and further procrastination on the just transition agenda will only serve to ensure and marginalize developing and emerging markets, which we all need and trade in. And this will only ensure that we miss the green industrial revolution and are again subordinated to a disproportionately low share and participation of the economic prosperity that will result from the green transition. If we didn't know, this is economic discrimination of the highest order, and one which we can address today if we choose, through our ESG mandates and lessons learned from today's supply chain challenges in our interdependent world, where, for example, the ingredients for COVID vaccines, as we've come to know, come from over 100 countries around our fragile globe. We have the data and the assessment frameworks now, and that is thanks greatly and largely to WBA and its Just Transition Alliance partners. So we have this data now to be able to measure and mitigate the devastating impact of our direct actions and inactions, which will cancel out the good we anticipated from our ESG investments due to a blind disregard to the S in all our ESG investments. The data is well established, and we can no longer say we will address the S tomorrow after the E. They go hand in hand and must be addressed as one. Scaling up climate adaptation finance must be conclusively addressed at COP26. UNCTAD estimates that the annual climate adaptation costs in developing countries could reach $300 billion in 2030, and if mitigation targets are breached, as much as $500 billion per annum by 2050. UNCTAD goes on to warn that the push to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services will benefit mainly exporters in developed countries and constrain fiscal capacity space in developing countries. The challenge to be resolved at this COP26 relates to mustering the courage and political will to disperse overdue promised just transition adaptation and mitigation funding, scale up and deliver projected just transition funding shortfalls, and to implement all just transition requirements. Anything short of this would be a leadership failure as we proceed to COP27 next year, where just transition will be the central issue and a potential deal breaker for the Paris Agreement, if not successfully set back on track and delivered now. This just transition is our collective responsibility as humanity to deliver and should be at the heart of all of our climate-related undertakings as we work to align with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and also observe and act on the increased calls for a just transition from the world's most affected and least emitting geographies, being developing and emerging markets. The just transition elephant in the Paris Agreement text needs to significantly pivot from pledges and broken agreed funding promises to a renewed global high action ambition towards an accurate calculation of the just transition funding needs, and therefore to a fully funded and dispersed equitable just transition, which must be fully integrated into the Paris Agreement to ensure climate action leaves no one behind. Let's stop overlooking the fact that we have the social license and mandate for immediate action on just transition, which is articulated and enshrined in the Paris Agreement. We are the hope of billions of affected communities across the developing and developed world, whose lives and livelihoods are in our hands. Let's not create a permanent just transition fueled pandemic for the developing world. We invest more daily to protect speculative economic risks in our markets let's invest optimally to avert this known and quantifiable just transition pandemic risk and avoid the inevitable degradation to our planet that will leave us with a myriad of stranded communities, stranded capital, and an astronomical cleanup bill that, if again left to tomorrow, could not restore the damage inflicted. We have the vaccine for the just transition pandemic, i.e. the funding and the assessment frameworks are available today. Let's distribute this equitably, fast, and today. We have seen the might of corporate leadership. Most of you in this room, all of you within our ecosystem, we've seen the might of your corporate leadership through ESG on global discriminatory issues, such as the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. And advocacy and action on the just transition agenda should be no different. Support for a just transition also delivers several SDGs, notably those relating to affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, gender equality, SDG 5, decent work and economic growth, SDG 8, reduced inequalities, SDG 10, responsible production and consumption, SDG 12, and climate action, SDG 13. Delivering the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals will require unprecedented economic and economy-wide transformation, political, corporate, and investor leadership. The World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA's Just Transition Assessments, provide a much-needed, evergreen Just Transition Assessment platform to assist companies and investors play their role, to support a just transition, to ensure that the associated costs and benefits of the just transition are predictable, fairly distributed, and leave no one behind. Our collective approach and delivery of a just transition must deliver climate and socio-economic outcomes, thereby accelerating the delivery of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. Unless we act today on ensuring promised adaptation and mitigation funding is dispersed, not just pledged at future COP summits or repledged at future COP summits, we are certainly going to lose the fight against climate change and become complicit sponsors of a gross miscarriage of climate justice, leaving nothing but stranded workforces, stranded assets, stranded communities, stranded capital, and an irretrievably diminished planet and divided and inequitable world for ourselves and future generations. In closing, we'll be watching with interest tomorrow's COP26 discussions here in Glasgow on finance and mobilizing public and private finance flows at scale for mitigation and adaptation. I would just like, in closing again, to thank you all for your attention, your inspiration, and leadership on the Just Transition agenda. Thank you very much, and back to you at WBA.
Thank you, Hubert. Those were very inspirational words. If that does not set the tone for the coming days, I would not know any different. But I'm very proud that today we will be sharing further insights into what the assessments on the just transition look like. So it is also my great pleasure to announce now Charlotte Hugman. She's our lead researcher and has been pivotal in establishing this methodology that we've used to perform these assessments. Charlotte has a background in corporate law and sustainability standards and has been part of the WBA for the last couple of years. Charlotte will provide an insight into these assessments and the key findings that will then further set out the grounds for the discussion we will have with the panel. Thank you, Charlotte. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Vicky, and thank you to all participants for joining today. We're really pleased to be able to present these results to you, and they're a result of some very important collaborative work that we've been doing, as Vicky said, for the past couple of years now. And so without further ado, I'll ask my colleague Sophia to move to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So before we dive into the results, we wanted to share with you an overview of the work that we do with WBA to put this work in context and to really set the theme for the goals that we have in sharing these results with you today. So as you can see, the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA as we're known, is benchmarking for a better world. We're a global not-for-profit organisation, and we develop free and publicly available benchmarks that is assessments and, for the most part, rankings of companies' performance, and we measure and compare them on their contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The goal is to make sure that our benchmarks really equip investors, as well as governments, civil society, individuals, and of course, very importantly, the companies themselves, with the information they need to engage further on their contributions to sustainable development and really step up where needed. The A in WBA is the Alliance, and we'll speak some more later about how our Alliance will amplify and use our Just Transition assessment results. But to set the scene as well in context, WBA has identified 7 systems transformations, as we call them, that we know will be needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Why do we do this? Well, we recognise the interconnected and interdependent nature of the SDGs. For example, it's not really possible to have one benchmark per SDG or one benchmark per industry. Instead, we recognise this interconnected nature of achieving sustainable development. And I emphasise that because that systems thinking is really the essence of what we're doing here on the Just Transition. So our goal is to assess 2,000 of the world's most influential companies across these 7 areas of transformation by 2023. And what we're presenting today is a big step forward in doing that across the social and climate and energy pieces of our work. On the next slide, we're just going to give you an overview here then of what a Just Transition assessment means for our work. So we're ensuring here that decarbonisation of companies, talking about their low carbon transition, reducing emissions, really goes hand in hand with a just and equitable transition for workers, communities, and other affected stakeholders whose lives and livelihoods will be impacted by the decarbonisation of our economy and our world. We've therefore been assessing and will continue to assess how are companies doing in respecting the rights of workers and communities and other stakeholders. This year, our pilot Just Transition assessment covers 180 companies in 3 key high-emitting sectors: 100 oil and gas, 50 electric utility, and 30 automotive manufacturing companies have been assessed this year. And the assessment is based on our methodology that's been built over the course of 2021 with our invaluable Just Transition advisory group. Indeed, several of our panelists here today are part of that advisory group, and we extend our thanks to that collaborative process, not only with the advisory group, but also to all of the people who inputted into the methodology during our public consultation earlier this year. So on the next slide, we see here how over the course of 2021, WBA has been building up into what we will present from next year, a real holistic assessment of climate and social company performance. So on the left-hand side, you see here where our journey has begun with benchmarking. And so far, the climate and energy benchmark has been ranking company performance against the emissions reduction transformation required to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. We benchmarked the same 180 companies, 100 oil and gas, 50 utilities, and 30 automakers, using the ACT, or Assessing Low Carbon Transition methodologies, in partnership with CDP and ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition. These benchmarks that are already free and publicly available have to date shown where companies are or aren't yet aligning with the Paris Agreement temperature goals in their low carbon transition strategies and actions. Over the same time period, my colleagues in the social team at WBA have developed what we call our core social indicators. And you see an overview of these on the right-hand side. We call this our social transformation framework. And this is going to be and is started to be applied to all of those 2,000 companies that we assess in order to ensure that companies are heading in the right direction to ensure they leave no one behind. So these industry and sector agnostic 18 indicators look at 3 areas of responsible business conduct. They look at respect for human rights, they look at providing and promoting decent work, and they look at whether companies are acting ethically. On the next slide, we see how this Just Transition assessment is bringing those 3 things together. So the ACT assessment represents the yellow slice you see, and the core social indicators represents the kind of red piece you see in the image on the right-hand side. What we've added in our Just Transition methodology are social indicators specific to the transformation of the high-emitting companies that are benchmarked in our climate and energy benchmark, and that transformation that's needed to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And these 6 indicators are rooted in the ILO guidelines and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So these 6 indicator areas are listed here. We have social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, as well as planning for a just transition as 2 of the first steps on the roadmap for companies' contributions to a real just transition. Indicators 3 and 4 cover green and decent job creation and the retention and reskilling or upskilling of workers as needed. And finally, indicators 5 and 6 look more at how companies are contributing to the system and using their influence. So are they contributing to social protection systems? How are they managing their social impact? And are they advocating for policies and regulations to support a just transition? The assessment results we'll be presenting are the results of taking the 18 core social indicators and these 6 just transition indicators to assess companies on where they're at the moment. So without further ado, I'm proud to present on the next slide our first key finding. So indeed, this overview and this key finding shows the number of companies score per band on the 16 points available on those 6 just transition indicators. We see very much that companies are, on the whole, at the beginning of this journey, and that the vast majority of the 180 high-emitting companies assessed are not yet demonstrating efforts towards a just transition that envisions and actually delivers resilient and thriving workers and communities. We see that only 9 of the 180 companies score above 50%. But we feel it's important because it's the beginning of the journey for so many. In our full report, which is free and publicly available online, we do also highlight where some companies are starting to show good practice. So, for example, we see also here there's one company really ahead of the rest of the pack, and that is the utility SSE, actually headquartered here in the UK. But it's so important that companies accelerate on this journey. Our estimates show that over 11 million workers are directly employed by the 180 companies assessed, and of course, millions more are employed in their supply chains, and yet millions more are affected in the rest of their value chain. So we really do need companies to, as Hubert said in his remarks, really look at the E and the S holistically and address the social impacts of the low carbon transition. On the next slide, we present our second key finding, which zooms in on the 2 first fundamental steps on the roadmap. As I mentioned, those 2 first indicators on social dialogue, which is at the heart of a just transition, stakeholder engagement, and impact mitigation, which are key to effective just transition planning, the second indicator. Again, we see here that performance is very low, actually, on these 2 indicators. And therefore, the voices and needs of the workers, communities, and those most vulnerable affected stakeholders are not yet being included in decisions that will have a huge impact on their livelihoods and their lives. In fact, we found that only 15 out of the 180 companies actually include the voices of those who will be impacted in their just transition planning. And as we see here on the right-hand side, only 2 companies actually fulfill all 4 elements of our indicator on just transition planning. And those companies are BP and SSE. But as I mentioned, please do dig deeper into the report because we find it's really important, and we therefore highlight some good practice examples and some case studies of companies that are already showing more contribution to this critical area. For example, French energy company Engie also shows good practice around stakeholder engagement and social dialogue. In the next slide, we see key findings 3, which zooms in on this delivery piece, indicators 3 and 4 of the roadmap. And we look at what companies are doing to create and provide and support access to green and decent jobs, and retain, reskill and upskill their workers for inclusive and balanced workforces of the future that are low carbon. So here we actually see more company action, particularly when it comes to job creation and reskilling practices. But a very low proportion of companies really zoom in on and have detail around how they are going to reskill workers, specifically for those jobs that are susceptible, that are really vulnerable to being displaced in the low carbon transition. But this is critical that they do that, because we know that for workers to be effective and well equipped, and also to be agents of change that support a sustainable future, companies must do all they can to make sure they have access to green and decent jobs. These jobs indeed must support a balanced and inclusive workforce, including what are known as vulnerable groups, so having gender balance and diversity really embedded, because a lack of commitment here means that displaced workers are really at risk in a low carbon transition, and that in itself also puts the success of the low carbon transition at risk. In our next key finding, on the next slide, we look then at those last two just transition indicators around corporate influence in a just transition. So these are around whether companies are contributing to social protection, social impact management, and advocacy for just transition. Unfortunately, this is where we see there's most room for companies to accelerate on the road, and only 4% actually the companies assessed actually demonstrate advocacy for just transition positive policies and regulations. We know that governments have a crucial role to play, of course, in a just transition, but companies' lobbying activities can really advocate for or undermine potential policies and regulations. That is why it's so key for us to see the companies using their influence and advocate for the policies necessary to support this transition. And our next and final of the 5 key findings zooms in then on the human rights aspect of companies' activities. As mentioned, these assessments were undertaken with both our core social and our just transition indicators. They go hand in hand. Indeed, the just transition assessment builds on the core social. And it's through the core social that we assess whether companies have the required human rights commitments and practices. Here again, our assessment highlights a gap and the process in place to for companies to actually ensure that they are acting on the commitments that they make. So here you see that only 12 of the 180 companies actually really demonstrate the basics of human rights due diligence, and a very worrying almost 1/4 of companies score 0 on all human rights related indicators. But again, as we see, companies have far to go, but our report does highlight some good practice across those last 3 indicators I mentioned. On green and decent job creation, we see Volkswagen and EDP, an energy company headquartered in Portugal, doing a lot to really help their workforce through the transition. In terms of social protection, we see Iberdrola as having many good practices, and we see that Galp and Enel, 2 European headquartered energy companies, are doing well on using their influence in advocacy. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So to set the scene for today's excellent discussion, I'm very much looking forward to. Our next steps are really all about what impact can we have. It's so important, we feel, to put these findings out into the world, but of course we know that we create impact by actually using these results. So companies may request their scorecards from us, and all stakeholders can freely access the full key findings reports, and the scores are available in an Excel file as well for any further insights and analysis. We really urge all stakeholders, particularly companies, to understand the key aspects of a just transition beyond the low carbon transition piece. So please do review and use the scores and the methodology, and engage with other initiatives that are part, for example, of our alliance, and also parts of the initiatives you'll hear from today. We ourselves will continue to drive a just transition forward collectively with our allies and with the organisations we work with. And you'll hear more about that at the end of this webinar. Then finally, just to mention, from 2022 and beyond, we will integrate the core social just transition and ACT indicators into one holistic assessment so that our climate and energy benchmark rankings will show how companies are performing not only on the low carbon emissions mitigation piece, but also on connecting that with their social impact to manage and mitigate those, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement holistically. And finally, it's day 3 of COP26, and we encourage anyone here, either on the ground in Scotland or who's joining virtually, to please reach out to our team. We have more virtual events coming up and we'll be here in person as well. Thanks very much. I'll hand back over to Vicky.
Thank you, Charlotte. And the link to the report will be shared. Sorry, I hear a small echo, so I'm just waiting for that to disappear. Thank you again, Charlotte, for this wonderful insight into our first assessments of 180 companies across 3 high-emitting sectors. The link of the report and the Excel file that Charlotte mentioned will be shared in the chat for everyone to digest afterwards. And we will really encourage everyone to read in on the best practices, because they really provide a good and significant guidance of what we would like to see as next steps. I also encourage everyone to use the chat or Q&A function for the upcoming next panel if you have any specific questions to any of our speakers, because we have time after the panel to dive into any of these Q&As. So now it's time to welcome a well-esteemed panel, 4 individuals that will help us to dive deeper into some of these assessments, but also to look at their own company's perspective on how important it is that we put really the social dialogue at the heart of the climate discussions that we are having in the coming days. So we will start by hearing from Mr. Richard Lockheed, member of the Scottish Parliament. He is the Scottish Government and the Minister for Just Transition and Employment and Fair Work. Richard was previously the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Food and Environment before becoming the Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science. We will then hear from Sam Smith. She's the director of the Just Transition Centre at the International Trade Union Confederation. The centre was established by the ITUC and partners to get concrete plans for the just transition at all levels. And previously, Sam held leading positions at WWF and within the energy sector. Then we will welcome Jessie Cato, who's the Natural Resource and Human Rights Program Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. Jessie is responsible for coordinating the work related to natural resources, including leading practices on the renewable energy sector and transition minerals, while also supporting the Resource Centre's broader work on human rights and the extractive industries. Jessie has broad experience in the natural resource governance, and prior to joining the centre, she worked at Oxfam America, and she coordinated the Extractive Industry Knowledge Hub. Both Sam as well as Jessie are also pivotal members of our Just Transition Advisory Group. Lastly, we will hear from Meredith Sumter. She's the CEO of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, a movement of the world's business and public sector leaders who are working to build more inclusive and sustainable trusted economic systems. And Meredith leads the work for the coalition along with private and public and civic stakeholders to drive reform initiatives and that make capitalism inclusive and its benefits more widely and equitably shared. So as I said, first we will move to Mr. Richard Lockhead, the Minister for the Scottish Parliament. Richard, the first welcome. Thank you for being here, and exciting times for you and for us to be here as a visitor to Scotland. First of all, the question to you is we've seen that Scotland has been quite a front runner in addressing the impacts of the decarbonisation plan in also the launch of your Just Transition strategy. So could you elaborate a little bit more about the highlights of your plans and how this could serve as leadership to other countries as well to follow?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me along today. And for the presentation as well, and I caught the last few minutes of that. I'm speaking to you from the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, but tonight I'm heading over to Glasgow for COP26 and my first appointments there as well, so I'm looking forward to catching up with the world community at what is a vitally important gathering. In terms of what we're doing in Scotland, I am Scotland's first just transition minister appointed at the recent elections we had here, and we took a decision as a government to appoint a just transition minister because we have very ambitious net zero targets in Scotland to achieve them by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the UK and many other parts of the world. And what we are saying is it's absolutely essential as we move towards our net zero targets that we work with our business community and companies. And we've just heard that there's a lot more that's got to be done by many of our high emitting companies in the world to ensure that we manage the way forward and that we keep people in good green jobs, good quality jobs, and that we have plans. This is something which is a hard lesson to learn from what's happened in the past, perhaps, where there's been economic transformation, but people have been left behind and communities have been scarred as a result. And we're very keen to avoid that ever happening again. So with the net zero transition over the next coming decades, we want to work in partnership with the business community, with communities. We also want to use this as an opportunity to tackle embedded inequalities in society as well and tackle poverty. So Scotland is well placed. We have a Just Transition Commission we've established in Scotland, and that is looking at how we can work with various economic sectors and various businesses, how we can work with communities, and the kind of principles we should adopt as part of the Just Transition. So going forward, we will, for instance, in the coming year, produce a Just Transition plan for the first key sector in Scotland, which is the energy sector, which is one of Scotland's most important sectors, which has to decarbonise in the years ahead. We're making good progress with decarbonising our electricity in Scotland, but there's a long way to go with the rest of the energy. So we're going to produce Just Transition plans, and they are going to be co-designed with people in businesses. For instance, just reflecting the presentation, we think co-design involving worker representatives and workers themselves in co-designing that Just Transition plan for each sector is really, really important to move forward in a just way. So that's just a quick overview. I could speak forever, but I'll just stop there because that's what we are doing in Scotland is making sure we're planning for the future. We are producing in line with the recommendations from our Just Transition Commission, which is an innovative body. We'll make sure we're going forward in a way that's fair and leaves no one behind.
Thank you so much. That's very inspiring to hear. And it's also great to hear how you are working with the private sector and to really make sure that they are part of the dialogue in creating this contribution to the ambition that you set. So I saw some questions coming in already, but we will hear from the other panelists first, and then we'll come back to you with some direct questions. So thank you for that. So Sam, for a question to you, or to start off with, before going into this COP, you warned the world leaders that are attending COP26 on their lack of action to reduce global emission with just transition measures should be put at, if they're not put at the heart, that it risks economic and political instability. So what is your view on the report that we've just launched and the role of the private sector, and how can we make this ambition really work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Charlotte. And before I go to your question, I just want to thank, well, first of all, I want to thank WBA for its work on the benchmark, the Just Transition benchmark, the indicators, and then also for the assessment. There are a lot of different versions of Just Transition out there, but we have a UN definition. It's in the Paris Agreement. It's been negotiated by experts from government, employers, and workers in our associations in the ILO. And that's what's reflected in this assessment and in the Just Transition indicators. From the trade union movement, we want to thank you, because we need a consistent understanding within the Paris Agreement space about what just transition is and is not. And I also just wanted to thank the opening speaker, Mr. Danso, for his remarks, because again, as a trade unionist, we really appreciate hearing such senior representatives from the investment community, from the political world, talk about our issues, the issues of workers, and how we risk being left behind as we try to bring down emissions, and about the centrality of just transition. It is indeed the elephant in the room of the Paris Agreement. But just to go to your question, what the assessment reveals is that there is a huge gap between what needs to happen right now in order to drive an energy transition that working people support and what most companies are actually doing. And we knew that, but the assessment just underpins the fact that only some companies are actually respecting labor rights, engaging in collective bargaining, making plans that are going to affect millions of jobs together with workers and their representatives. What we're seeing in the COP right now is that there are a lot of targets. There are rather fewer commitments to what we have been demanding, which is that we get national plans, national funding for just transition, and we also get more commitments from employers on this issue. And what concerns us as trade unions is that we know that energy sector emissions and emissions from other high emitting industries need to start coming down now, right? We know that. But this also has to happen in a way so that the hundreds of millions of people who today are employed in high quality jobs in energy and manufacturing have a new and high quality job to go to, or that they keep the job they have, even if some of the methods of production or technologies change. And without that, we're concerned that as the world tries to recover from COVID in the face of hundreds of millions of people having lost their jobs permanently during the pandemic, the vaccine inequality that Mr. Danso so eloquently described, the fact that countries in the global south are struggling to restart their economies without at the same time having access to vaccines. If you add an inequitable transition where the good jobs that you have today in the energy sector or in manufacturing disappear or become worse, it's really a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster on poverty eradication. It's a recipe for disaster on rights. And it is also a recipe for disaster on climate action. If people see that actions by governments or employers to bring down emissions cause them to lose their jobs, especially at this time of high global unemployment in many, many countries, then they are not going to be supportive of climate action. They will actually be against it. So, we're looking at the results of this COP with some skepticism and sadness, because on the one hand, we are seeing some big commitments to action on climate, but we're not seeing the corresponding commitments yet to just transition. I want to highlight one area again that Mr. Danso brought up, which is the role of just transition in climate finance. So there is huge interest from different institutional investors, from multilateral development banks, and so on, in financing a transition, the energy sector, and particularly the phase out of coal. We're seeing rather less interest in tying this finance to observance of fundamental labor rights, and in particular to the role of workers and our representatives in a just transition. And we want to say to investors, to donors, to multilateral development banks, and to the banks themselves, that this is the wrong road. The road that we need to be on is one in which human and labor rights are respected. Workers in our associations are part of negotiating our futures, and we try to strengthen the collective bargaining agreements that workers currently have in energy sector companies, as opposed to weakening them. We want to come out of this with more good, more decent jobs, as opposed to fewer. And I am reminded that yesterday I was in a webinar with my comrade from the South African trade unions, who was explaining that due to South Africa's extraordinarily high unemployment rate at the moment, 44%, if you count people who've given up looking for work. When you're talking about just transition, you're not just talking about replacing jobs that might disappear in coal. You're actually talking about the need to create 4 new jobs, 4 good new jobs for every single job that disappears. So we would love to see the alliance that the WBA is putting together. We would love to work with investors to try to make decent job creation a reality as we bring down emissions. I have a couple more thoughts about the assessment. I'll just give them really quickly. As I read it, I was struck by how many of by seeing the companies that one would expect to see with good practice being highlighted. Knowing those companies a bit more from the inside and what their practices are, we would also just say that often the devil is not just in the details, the devil is in the supply chain. And the devil is in the activities of companies outside their home base. Companies that are doing well in this assessment, they are more or less wall-to-wall union in their home countries. They get outside their home countries, it can be a different matter. So we're really appreciating the increased transparency and focus that the assessment is bringing to labor issues and to just transition. And we're also looking forward to following up with the companies who participated in order to help them improve their performance across all of these measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam, and very inspiring as always. And it's good to indeed highlight the supply chain transparency aspect. And I'm sure that there's some opinions about that later as well on how companies could further play their influential role in that. So thank you. We'll get back to you with some questions later. Now it's time to hear from Jessie. As I already introduced, you have specifically looked at the human rights impact on, for example, the renewable sector. So eager to hear from your learnings there as well, but also how you could see this, the assessments we've made on the just transition with a wider lens, how that actually complements some of the work that you've done, and what are your main takeaways, but also recommendations for the people listening in today. So thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the World Benchmarking Alliance for inviting me, and to Richard and Sam for those very powerful comments before to set the scene. When I looked at the findings, I think I found them really troubling, but I unfortunately don't see them as that surprising. So at the Resource Centre, we view climate change as the biggest threat to human rights, and we support the movement to a fast energy transition. But we also feel really strongly that this transition must happen in a way that is rights respecting, and that requires significant action from companies. And I think what this assessment indicates is that's either not happening or not necessarily happening with the speed in which it needs to. Our work at the Resource Centre is very complementary to the Just Transition assessment in being able to highlight particularly the human rights impacts of the energy transition, not just what's occurring, but what may happen as this process goes along. And in some very good timing, today we have launched our second renewable energy and human rights benchmark. And this looks at the human rights policies and practices of the 15 largest wind and solar producers. So while most companies have shown modest improvement from our first benchmark in 2020, overall, our findings are echoing the findings of the assessments, and that's that the current course of action is not doing enough to help those most impacted by the climate crisis. As the assessments point out, companies in high-emitting sectors are largely failing to demonstrate the basics of identifying and managing human rights risks. And our benchmark confirms this findings. So the benchmarks companies have an average score of just 28%. We look at 2 sets of indicators for the renewable energy benchmark. One is the core corporate human rights benchmark indicators, and then sector-specific indicators, which through consultation we developed and feel represent the most salient risks within the renewable energy sector. And this includes Indigenous peoples and affected community rights, land rights, human right and environmental defenders, labour health and safety, and also right to a healthy and clean environment. Now, the companies that we benchmark score significantly higher on the CHRB indicators. They score very poorly on the sector-specific indicators, and the average score across this is just 16%, and 1 in 5 companies didn't show any improvement from 2020. Another finding from the assessments indicates that businesses are still not using their influence to protect people or manage social impacts, and again, we see this echoed within our benchmark findings. The renewable energy sector is unfortunately not taking the opportunity yet to significantly innovate in these areas. And particularly concerning to us at the Resource Centre is how the energy transition will impact land rights. So onshore wind and solar projects obviously require significant land footprint, and yet none of the companies that we benchmark have any policies explicitly respecting land rights within their own operations, or had policies in place that make explicit commitments to identify legitimate tenure right holders. Another intersection we're seeing is on Indigenous rights. This often crosses over with abuses related to land rights and environmental defenders. And yet just under a quarter of companies had policies explicitly recognizing and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, we know, are on the front line of the climate crisis and already feeling the impacts of climate change. They're also on the front of transition mineral mining and the increase in exploration and licensing. And they're also now on the front of renewable energy projects. So this particular gap from renewable energy companies we find particularly concerning. We're also find a worrying trend in that no company had adopted explicit policies committing itself to non-retaliation against human rights and environmental defenders. And this is despite the fact that the Resource Centre has recorded over 30 attacks against defenders in the renewable energy sector in 2020. So I think one of the notable things we notice is that how in sync a lot of these findings are, both at a much broader range that the WBA looks at, and then quite sector specific on what the Resource Centre is looking at. The indicators themselves are, I think, a super powerful tool, as Sam said, having common definitions that are agreed upon, that people are committing to, I think is so useful for the Resource Centre to be able to integrate into this benchmark, but also our other pieces of research going forward. So we know what we're asking companies and we know what companies are agreeing to. But I think overall what this really does show is that business at the moment is just failing to act on a just transition, and that failure is creating harm for communities, for workers and the environment. And we feel that this increase in human rights violations around the renewable energy sector is a major threat to the energy transition as a whole.
Thank you, Jessie. Very powerful words from you. And it's clear that there is still a long road ahead of us. And you make it quite clear what the role of the private sector is. And we already heard that it's important that we make a link between public and private sector. So I think it's really now timely to move to Meredith, who has made her ambition with inclusive capitalism to make that link and both step up the ambition to reach a just transition. So Meredith, very happy that you're here to provide some insights into how you work with inclusive capitalism on driving both public and private sector cooperation forward into achieving some of these goals. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Vicki, and thanks again to WBA and to the panelists for a very important and much needed discussion. I think that the implications of the Just Transition Assessment findings and results notes that we are at the very beginning stages of companies recognizing the need for a transition that advances both social and environmental goals. We find that companies are really focused on just carrying out the environmental aspects and targets of transition. And, if you look at the data that you put forth, the social and economic justice goals that we're talking about are an additional element that only a handful of the assessed companies have begun to really incorporate into their strategies. And so I think we have to recognize that we're really at the starting point of most companies understanding what a just transition is and how they can technically operationalize just transition in a way that aligns with the existing scholarship on what is needed, has proven effectiveness on the ground. I think that's something that we hear about from companies. How do we know that the practices that we take are going to be effective and welcomed and recognized by those that are experts in just transition? But also, how can they take actions that markets would recognize and reward? And this gets back to the comments that Sam had made earlier on the importance of the investor support for this work. So I think at the council, we were asked to take a look at just transition and to come up with a way to help companies get to move rather from a dialogue on what the just transition is to actual action. And what we found in talking to companies about this is that much of the just transition literature was written for use by governments or had a civil societal lens, with some exception. That the B team's work on just transition, along with the ITUC, provided really important guidance for companies. And I think Sam and ITUC's Sharon Burrow, who's a council steering committee member, for their leadership there, in addition to that of the B team and BSR. But Vicki, what has been lacking is definition around what would constitute, let's say, specific core practices or advanced practices that companies can take to transition justly, and that important market and benchmark stakeholders, such as WBA, would recognize as legitimate just transition actions. I think also lacking is, and what is really critical at this early stage of this work for companies, is a wide availability of examples for companies to consider and to learn from. So often, these companies are looking for best practices or real world case studies of how businesses are experimenting with just transition and the considerations or trade-offs companies face and manage when they're balancing social and economic justice goals along with the transition targets and the quarterly reporting that they're also on the line for. So, I think bottom line, the implications of the just transition assessment tell us that what is needed is more companies recognizing what a just transition is and the actions that they can and should take, as well as really their role and their agency in making this happen at a time. I think, with the exception of the Scottish government, and thank you so much, Richard, for your leadership there, I think we also have to recognize that all this is coming at a time when we just have really nascent government regulatory support and really just early investor support for it. So, we need more companies recognizing that the transition itself will be at risk if the important social impacts are not managed and the benefits of transition not more broadly shared. We need more companies clearly incorporating just transition into their plans and sharing learnings as they implement those plans, as well as practices for others to try and innovate from. So Vicki, you'd mentioned that the council's work in this space, and this Friday, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism will be launching a private sector focused guide on just transition actions businesses can take. And we invite companies to join us in learning about just transition and to put forth their own actions to advance social equity as a key goal of their transition. I'm happy to share more about that now, or perhaps a little bit later when we get on to the discussion about that framework for company actions, how it was designed, and how companies can learn more and get involved and take their own actions for just transition.
Thank you, Meredith, and it would be super indeed if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think it's a great initiative as well. So, but just on your last remark around the fact that you say, okay, we need this translation of what does best practice look like and what is needed in terms of guidance, but how can also sort of regulatory framework support? I would like to then ask maybe Mr. Richard Lockhead, if you could give a bit of an insight into how you approaching this, because like you said, you're the first minister for just transition, and I wonder what is it that you will take if you take now later the train to Glasgow tonight. It's like, what is going to be your message there? Is it how are we going to make sure that we really translate the language to include multi-stakeholders? Like you said, you involve the private sector, how you involve the workers. What is going to be your message to other ministers or world leaders on this? How can we make sure that we are indeed as inclusive as possible to make sure that this is heard by all the parties and that they are felt heard in this discussion?
Thanks. Well, it's a good question, and clearly we're all in this together, and we think it's really important to work in partnership with all sectors of society as we go through the economic transition which we're putting in place in Scotland for the next 10 years. But of course, that's part of the journey to 2045 and our net zero targets. And what we're doing as a government is looking at where we can bring influence to bear. So we want to get to a stage where every public pound that's spent in Scotland, for instance, delivers what we want to see in terms of net zero targets being achieved and the just transition. So for instance, if we have already given a commitment that we will consult on the principle that if you want any public sector grants or business, that you have to produce a just transition plan in your business. And of course, the principles behind that just transition plan would be that you work in tandem with your workforce, where many of the best ideas will come from in terms of the changes that any business will have to undertake to reduce its carbon footprint and play its role in achieving targets. And that's why we are being quite innovative. We, as I said before, we have a Just Transition Commission. It's given us lots of recommendations and principles to follow, all of which we've adopted. And we're about to test that for the first time when we do produce Scotland's first Just Transition Plan for one of our key sectors, which is the energy. We're refreshing our energy strategy in Scotland. And as you know, Scotland has a big fossil fuel sector in oil and gas in the North Sea. And it's been a major economic plank for Scotland and the UK since the end of the 1960s into the 70s. So that's a massive change that has to be undertaken there, and we have to make sure that people have good jobs and green jobs to go to, and we have to work in partnership. So each business would be expected to make sure there's a strong voice for its employees as it goes through that transition. So that's just one example of what we're looking at, but there's lots of other different examples. And we have some businesses in Scotland at the moment, some of our energy companies and power companies that are beginning to look at a just transition. And what we're doing is equipping, making support available, such as for upskilling and reskilling, and there's transition funds available and funds for new technologies. We have massive commitments put in place, and also all our new policies, whether they're economic or social policies, like we're about to create a new national care service for Scotland, that will have at the heart of it fair work. And fair work includes in giving our employees a strong voice in their business, and that's all part of the net zero agenda as well.
Thank you so much. Very, very insightful. And Meredith, maybe then a question to you is, there was already a mention around the need for to unlock also finance for supporting the just transition. I was wondering, how do you feel about the conversations that you have with the companies that you have as a membership of the inclusive capitalism? How do you see the translation to the role to the investor community around the need to support this just transition?
Well, thanks, Vicki. I think in many ways our conversations with the investor networks are that they are looking for measurable ways that they can assess progress of what companies are really leading in this work, and in that the WBA's assessment, as well as the forthcoming Climate Action 100 Net Zero Benchmark Just Transition Indicator are, I think, in important ways that market investors can understand the actions that companies are taking both now and where they can lead in their just transition work moving forward. I just want to emphasize, I think we're really at the beginning stages of what this looks like, and that we can only expect action to scale as more and more companies understand, okay, so technically, what action should I take that would constitute just transition, and that also that market investors would recognize.
Sorry, I think we've lost Meredith for a second. So I'm sorry, Meredith, we will come back to you once we have secured the connection. But then I would like to first go, also would like to hear more from Jessie around the comment that Sam made on the need to look further into the supply chains, because I've heard that from Sam, that it's really great to see these examples of these companies to work well on the core principles, but of course it's also how they are using their responsibility and influence on the whole of the supply chain. And I know that you have deep dived in some of these sectors where the supply chain is playing a crucial role. So would like to know from you on those remarks from Sam, if you could give some of your reflections.
Yeah, I mean, we focus on the transition mineral mining. We have a key focus on 6 commodities that we feel are really core, because those commodities are pivotal to renewable energy technology, and then on renewable energy projects themselves, but very much keen to embed human rights across that supply chain. I think what we've seen from from COVID, those are different things, and from, you know, some of the other news stories that have come out around human rights violations within the renewable energy supply chain, is that we know that there's human rights violations occurring across them. We know that the opaque nature of supply chains is very much contributing to that. We know that some geopolitical motivations are going to perhaps move forward into changing some of the supply chains in terms of supply, and companies also wanting to secure themselves within that. But what we don't see at the moment is that consideration of workers, of communities, and of human rights as we look towards making those more transparent. I think the EU mandatory human rights due diligence regulations that are coming in are going to be a significant game changer, not just in the sense of bringing transparency to supply chains, but also we have seen, particularly from the extractive side, that the time has very much passed for voluntary measures for companies, particularly around making those human rights due diligence requirements mandatory and making that reporting mandatory. But I think a couple of other people have mentioned as well, we also know that investors are going to play a particularly important role going forward around where they're putting their investments, if those are into ethical or rights respecting sectors and rights respecting companies. And so we do feel that kind of momentum coming both from the regulatory side, but from the investor side, with much more interest in being able to show how these businesses operate, is starting to create a bit of momentum for companies to really show their work maybe, but also act on implementing human rights due diligence where perhaps there hasn't been that impetus as much before.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Thank you for that reflection. And I encourage all participants to put any Q&A in the chat if you have any questions to any of these individual panelists, because I think now there is this unique opportunity to ask them direct questions. Sam, did you want to come in to say something? I saw you on mute.
No, I thought you might ask me a question. Okay. So if you would ask me a question, go ahead, or otherwise I can make a remark.
Question for Charlotte first. Charlotte, I see that there's a question around multi-stakeholder involvement, that there is a need to really make sure that, as I said before, and I think this was reflected by some of the panelists as well, to make sure that we take into account the different types of stakeholders that need to work together to solutions, but that maybe zooming into just company action could miss certain aspects of that. So Charlotte, do you want to answer that question?
Certainly, thanks so much, Vicky. And I think some of Richard's comments also addressed this very insightful question from a participant around whether zooming in on the company action aspect of a just transition might miss the point around actions of government, particularly at city, a regional level, and indeed place-based action is very, very important. So WBA really focuses primarily indeed on these 2,000 most influential companies, and specifically on just transition. This year we've looked at the 180 high emitters. What we do then is to work with others to use that data to engage not only with governments, but also with investors, civil society. We've kept the indicators at the more fundamental level in acknowledgement of the fact that this area is relatively nascent and companies are already getting out of the starting blocks. And we've taken a sector agnostic approach in order to capture this year, and in the couple of years we think going forward, the lay of the land to, as I say, get companies going on this journey, in the hope that this spurs interest and will then link up with the kinds of initiatives that are needed at the local level. So as Richard spoke to, you know, for Scotland and their energy plan, and we also have activities within the WBA and through our alliance and many of our allies' activities to do deeper dives into certain regions, areas, and the local context. We do look, of course, for evidence of, as I mentioned, particularly around those last two indicators on social protection contributions and advocacy, also about how our companies interacting with governments, we see that they need to work together really to drive this forward. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I'm mindful of time. I just want to ask all panelists, but starting with Sam, one last question is that you said that you are looking at this COP with some fear, and I wonder if that what would success look like for you in if you look back in 2 weeks' time, and then also looking forward to next year's COP that Hubert referred to, is that how are we going to make sure that we are really driving the social dialogue at the heart of the climate discussion, and make sure that we walk away after 2 weeks here and feel that we are equipped to really drive tangible action for the next 12 months to come, and that if we see each other again at COP27, that we see that this has actually sort of was the ground for starting off the really just transition dialogue.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for that. I mean, I think that one key thing about the indicators that WBA has developed and about the assessment is that, again, they reflect what has actually been negotiated in the UN, including in the International Labour Organization, with this emphasis on social dialogue. And for those who are listening who don't really know what that is, I want to stress that this is a defined process between workers and our unions, employers, and sometimes governments. And collective bargaining, so the process by which workers negotiate as a group, negotiate contracts with employers that cover wages and conditions, but can also cover how the company is going to bring down its emissions or gender rights or other issues. That is also part of social dialogue. And so when we're talking about social dialogue, we're not talking about a multi-stakeholder process, as the indicators make clear. We're talking about something different from, but it's a multi-stakeholder consultation, but also essential to just transition. If without it, you don't have just transition. And I'm just saying this because to go to Hubert's point, if we're really going to have just transition at this COP and the next COP, then a couple of things need to happen now that will lay the foundation for that. So for one thing, the UK government has put forward a just transition declaration signed by a number of countries that are actually donors to multilateral financing, committing to what has been negotiated on just transition in the UN, working with the ILO and incorporating this fundamental part of social dialogue and labor rights. And so one is that we see that gets announced, which it will be on Thursday, more countries join. And we see that by the next COP, that countries are actually attaching labor rights and this requirement for social dialogue to their climate financing. They're attaching decent work standards to it. And then two is that by the next COP, we see real progress to fulfilling this initial commitment of 100 billion in climate finance for developing countries with these conditions attached to it. That would be a pretty big thing. It would drive a lot of real change, decent job creation in many countries in the developing world who are struggling under debt and the impacts of COVID. And so we think that just that would be a huge achievement.
Absolutely, Sam. I hope nobody can disagree with that. So thank you for that. Meredith, we lost you on your last comments because the connection dropped off. That's, of course, working in a virtual environment, as we all know. But you mentioned that you're launching the Just Energy Transition Framework for Company Action. And then maybe for some closing remarks, also, when will this, you're launching it on a Friday, but also when would this be a success for you? And how would you like to look back on this in terms of action if we look back in a year's time?
Great, thank you so much, Vicki. Yes, and just I think echoing the comments that my colleagues have made today. I mean, you've got to give companies the tools to understand what a just transition is at a technical and operational level, and the actions they can take that would constitute just transition on the ground. You've got to give investors a comparable way of assessing what companies are doing in this space so that they can move their money to those companies who are leading by adding to social equity. And you need a framework that companies can use to advocate with government on regulatory support that would aid just transition. So as you mentioned, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism earlier this year launched a Just Energy Transition workstream convening 7 energy and energy intensive companies, ASIN, Anglo American, BP, SSE, Eni, Reliance Industries, and Repsol, along with the ITUC, the Grantham Research Institute, major investors such as CalPERS and State Street and Inclusive Capital Partners, as well as with the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action Finance. And together, this workstream developed a business-focused guide for actions that companies can take to transition to net zero energy in ways that ensures that the benefits are realized by workers, communities, and customers, and that the risks to them from transition are mitigated. So this work drew from the existing literature, including from the ILO guidelines, the Paris Agreement, the Scottish Government, thank you again, Richard, the B Team and ITUC work, and insight from the Vatican Dialogues on Just Transition. And from that existing literature, we came up with a framework for company actions that's divided into 4 pillars with a total of 20 specific areas for action that companies can take to transition in a way that is just, that is applicable to all sectors. So it was developed with energy intensive companies, but these areas for action really do apply across sectors. And it's meant not to be prescriptive, but to serve as a guide for companies in defining and implementing their transition plans. Moving towards action is what would be success for us. One last point here I think is very important, is that where possible, these areas for action, they were tied to the assessment criteria of the World Benchmarking Alliance's Just Transition methodology, as well as Climate Action 100's Just Transition indicator in its net zero benchmark. And this was done intentionally to align the framework and areas for company actions with the Just Transition assessment methodologies to benchmark company progress and to enable markets to recognize and reward those companies that were transitioning justly. So as you noted, that the release of that Just Energy Transition Framework for Company Actions is this Friday. And we invite all companies to make use of this framework and to document their actions for just transition with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. Success for us is companies documenting their work in this space, and much of it is going to be early work in this space, because when other companies see what actions their peers are taking, they get ideas for what they themselves can do, concrete ideas. And we're also developing a learning lab of resources.
Sorry, I think okay, sorry, yes, sorry. You're back, Meredith, go ahead.
So my apologies. We're also developing a learning lab for resources drawing from our partners and collaborating partners, including the World Benchmarking Alliance's assessment methodology. So companies can begin to learn and take their actions and innovate off of the best practices and actions of others. So we need that action to start now, and we need that action to scale. And we start by making sure that companies are sharing their actions with one another.
Thank you so much, Meredith. That was very powerful, and thank you for really articulating that call to action very loudly. So we are at time. So I would really like to thank all panelists and wish you all the best of luck with the COP negotiations ahead and your contributions. And we're here to drive further collective action forward. So thank you for your valuable contributions and continuing to support the World Benchmarking Alliance work. So thank you for that. Now it's time that I welcome Martina McPherson and Teresa Nicholson, because they both speak to the opportunity for investors to use their influence to guide and drive the transition of high-emitting sectors. We've heard a lot already about the role of finance and how are we going to unlock capital so that we don't end up with stranded capital, like Hubert phrased this. So there's a lot of power in your hands. So I'm very pleased that you're joining us today with a big announcement around your commitment on really allocating and driving the capital forward to supporting this just transition. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky and Nikki and the entire WBA team for making this transition happening. It's a transition that hopefully will also lead to transformation. And my name is Martina McPherson. I'm one of the investor co-leads together with Therese Nicholson at 91, who is actually looking at the specifics on how investors could align forces to provide a basis, a foundation for collaborative initiatives surrounding the just transition. I'm the head of the ESG strategy division at Oddo BHF Asset Management. I'm also president of the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets and a visiting fellow at Henley Business School. So hence wear 3 different hats in combining education, capacity building and advocacy for many of the different ESG topics that we need across industry, and ultimately with and when how a multi-stakeholder engagement effort with science, with academia and with NGOs is clearly needed and needs to also be expanded and involve policymakers, regulators and others that have fortunately now joined forces on many of the important ESG topics that we have seen. And we at Oddo BHF Asset Management support a broad range of coalitions, initiatives, and methodology work streams supporting the climate, the ecological, and the just transition. And we really aim to utilize the 6 transition indicators to expand our ESG assessments within our proprietary ESG methodology, which means it will end up in portfolio construction when and where we are making decisions that are aligning environmental and social criteria. And we have already a broad array of them with a slight overweight towards social issues, which is quite interesting. And again, proprietary to our own specific approach. And then, of course, we aim to bring the context for just transition assessment towards portfolio construction analysis. And we are starting already with an active ownership concept that actually will utilize the different indicators to better assess how companies by sectors are actually addressing just transition / social issues in particular. And why we have chosen to co-lead the just transition is varifold. 2021 is a pivotal year for several reasons. It's the year of COP26. We are still finding ourselves within the COVID context. And it also marks the acceleration of efforts to combat global warming. We have seen multiple reports from UNFCCC, the IEA, IPCC, and many others, but many of them still highlight the climate and increasingly ecological commitments and actions we need to move the needle. But there is clearly now, this is the year, there is a need for actually moving from voluntary to mandatory action when it comes to taxonomy, when it comes to regulatory requirements, but also when it comes to investor ambitions to actions. And these type of activities must include social criteria. So, we are highlighting that the shift towards net zero emissions and industry focused and centered solutions, may they be on the corporate, may they be on the investor side, can actually create new opportunities. We've seen that in the IEA report. We see a creation of up to 16 million new jobs in the energy sector alone that are coming out of the net zero emission ambitions, and when and where and how different industries together with investors can work on actually offsetting some of the losses we've seen. May they be job losses, may they be losses to economic growth and prosperity. But when and where and how these losses can be turned into positive upside. We also look at now building the relevant frameworks together with coalitions such as the WBA to actually enhance existing models for assessments that create a better perspective on financial and non-financial impacts. We have seen the great work that's been done for TCFD, on climate risk, for TNFD, on biodiversity risk, and we feel now it's the time again to move the trajectory and needle towards a transition to a low carbon economy that does also include ecological and societal factors and progress, growth, prosperity that ultimately leaves no one behind, as we've heard today. And we hope that through this collaborative engagement coalition we are launching, that we can support other investors and corporations on positive change trajectories towards human and worker rights, towards stakeholder and community dialogue and engagement, and towards supporting better supply chain management oversight and due diligence, while complying with the normative and regulatory frameworks that support these, which are already in place and are of course being developed and enhanced over time. So I'm handing over to Therese Nicholson now, and we are both very delighted to make this call for other investors, for corporations, and for NGOs and other coalitions to join forces here to actually create an impactful transition coalition that will lead to further transformation. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Martina, and congratulations, Vicky, on a great report and a very important session. I'm Therese, and I'm Head of Sustainability for 91. For those of you who know who we were previously Investec Asset Management, and we are, of course, a company that originated out of an emerging market, so South Africa. And South Africa, as many of you will know, is one of the most challenged markets in the world when it comes to shifting to a low carbon economy. According to the World Economic Forum Energy Transition Index, recently it ranked towards the lower end at 106 out of 116 nations in terms of this. And for reasons that have been highlighted earlier, particularly by Samantha, this is obviously a country that is facing a lot of socioeconomic issues, not least in terms of employment, but also poverty, and then also reliant on, unfortunately, on a very fossil fuel intense electricity grid in particular. This means that the way that we have approached this issue as an organization is one where we want to try and finance behind the transition, not stepping away, and really distinguishing between what can be conceived as a net zero portfolio approach versus portfolios that work for net zero, to which of course just transition needs to be an essential part to this. And just to add to what Martina has articulated so well, I think there are two particular areas that we as sustainability experts in the investment stage industry can have an impact. One is internally, by working with our investment teams to ensuring that this concept, which is quite complex and looks different, if you like, in emerging markets to developed markets to a large extent, is better understood, and that it's integrated in the way that we assess alignment and transition plans. But then also importantly as well, with the work that we do in the active ownership space, from the engagements that we now should be having on the back of getting more and better information to this area, and then of course following that through in the broader active ownership sort of space as investors. So this is really just an invitation and a heads up to our colleagues out there from across the industry to get involved. And Martina and I will do the best to sort of start this project, and we look forward to working with you all. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Therese, and both Martina as well. It's really amazing to see the leadership of Oddo and 91 in this respect, in leading this collective impact coalition. And indeed, the invitation to all organizations that are eager to drive this collective action forward is there. So please reach out to us. I'm mindful of time. I know everyone has an extremely busy schedule this week. So I really want to conclude with one last remark, and that is that the race to a net zero future is not a race against each other. This is a race against time. And we will only win this if we raise it together, and to really make sure that affected workers and communities are not left behind. So thank you all for joining this panel and this event today. I wish you all a lot of luck and success in the coming 2 weeks. And I really look forward to see many of you, and otherwise either virtual or in person, and looking forward to reconnect as well after COP. So thank you and wish you a good day. Bye.